And thank you, Professor Tamer, for inviting me. And I'd like to express my thanks to everyone at the center who made every problem vanish instantaneously. In fact, I would say I think your staff is a little bit too good. I'm reluctant at this point to complain about anything, lest it inspire people to devote too much zealous attention to eliminating the difficulty. I should also thank Larry Kaplan for saying such nice things about me yesterday. And I would reciprocate now if it weren't for the fact that you've known everybody and they've known you for a day and a half, and it's superfluous to recite his virtues. So I'll just move on to my talk. There has been a great deal of scholarly debate about when modern Jewish history commenced. But I don't know of anyone who has comprehensively addressed the question of when the Jews began to regard themselves as dwellers in something identifiable as modernity, and what concept they formed of it. But that's my task here today, and since I've got to start somewhere, I'll begin with the man who used to be the point of departure for all discussions of Jewish modernity, Moses Mendelssohn, whom Larry has already discussed very usefully. Born in Dessau in 1729, Mendelssohn was, as is well known, one of the leading figures of the Aufklärung. In addition, he has long been recognized as the first modern philosopher of Judaism, the first Jew in modern times to attempt to reconcile Judaism with the regnant philosophy of his day. He is perhaps even better known for his efforts to lead Central European Jewry out of its cultural isolation and into the friendlier, more liberal-minded sphere that had recently come into being in its vicinity. Mendelssohn clearly believed that he lived at, in his words, an auspicious hour in which the full rights of humanity in their correct measure are taken to heart. But did he also believe that the world had in crucial respects made decisive and irreversible advances? Surprisingly enough, the great inaugurator of Jewish modernity did not maintain that modern times occupied any special place in the whole scheme of things. This is doubly surprising in view of the fact that he lived at a time characterized by a very heightened consciousness, to say the least, of the progressive trajectory of history and the key significance of the modern period in the development of mankind. There's no better representative of this tendency than a famous work by Mendelssohn's close friend, Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, The Education of the Human Race. According to Lessing's scheme of things, Judaism had flourished only at a stage of antiquity characterized by a fairly low level of religious understanding. Mendelssohn could only have found this objectionable, but instead of directly disputing his friend's condescending depiction of his own religion, he announced his rejection of his entire outlook. I, for my part, he wrote in 1781 in his Jerusalem, cannot conceive of the education of the human race as my late friend Lessing imagined it. It did not seem to Mendelssohn that it was the purpose of providence that mankind as a whole advance steadily here below and perfect itself in the course of time. He believed instead that individual humans made advances, but mankind continually fluctuates within fixed limits while maintaining on the whole about the same degree of morality in all periods, the same amount of religion and irreligion, of virtue and vice, of happiness and misery. What Mendelssohn saw in history instead of progress was cyclicality, but it was a subject on which he did not say very much. What he seems to have thought about the intrinsic weaknesses of modern civilization that would lead to its demise has been teased out of some of his minor writings by Matt Ehrlin. Erland's effort is interesting, but it is one that we need not consider here, for he does not claim, and there is no reason to believe, that Mendelssohn's concept of modernity's inherent weaknesses stemmed from his Judaism. Mendelssohn is commonly regarded as the father of the Haskalah, the Jewish branch of the Enlightenment, that developed in his own day, initially in Germany. In a series of recent works, the Israeli historian Shmuel Feiner has effectively contested this view and shown that he was less the progenitor of the Haskalah than its favorite icon. But regardless of whether this is true or not, the pioneering leaders of this movement ought to be the next stop in our quick exploration of Jewish concepts of modernity. The Maskilim, or enlighteners, as Feiner has shown, were the first group of Jews to have a consciousness of modernity, a sense of living in a new and better world characterized above all by an unprecedented level of religious toleration. The man Feiner identifies as the actual father of the Haskalah, Isaac Kook, a Copenhagen-born Hebrew writer who had studied for a while with Kant in Königsberg, quote Feiner, says Feiner, made a key contribution to the Maskilic period of the past by singling out Moses Mendelssohn as the key figure of the new period in Jewish history. Subsequently, Feiner writes, Mendelssohn appeared in every Maskilic periodization as the end of the dark period and at the opening of the new era of light, reason, tolerance, and moral regeneration of Jewish society. Mendelssohn thus became the emblem of an era of which he was not exactly a wholehearted admirer. The Maskilim were committed modernizers who remained, at least at the outset, faithful Jews, but they did not draw their outlook on the contemporary world from Jewish sources. Their concept of modernity was, as Feiner notes, almost identical to that of the French philosophes and the German Aufklärer. Much the same could be said of the reformers who followed them, chronologically, if not in all respects, ideologically. The German university-educated rabbis who eventually became their leaders were bent on harmonizing Judaism with modernity, an era with which they found no fault, other than its all too frequent dismissal of Judaism as an outmoded relic of the past. This harmonization required, to a greater or lesser degree, the erasure of those facets of Jewish belief and behavior that were in tension with modern rationalism, with the modern rationalism from which they took their bearings, such as the expectation of a personal Messiah who would lead the Jews back to the Holy Land, the avoidance of biblically forbidden food, and practices instituted by the ancient rabbis. Modernity, in the reformers' eyes, provided the Jews with the intellectual tools to pare their religion down to the ethical monotheism that had always constituted its essence and demonstrated its basic superiority, but had unfortunately been buried beneath too much ritualism and too much superstition over the millennia. If modernity won the support of the Maskilim and the reformers, it alarmed those who wished to preserve Judaism as it had been, and who became the leaders of what became known just around this time, at the turn of the 19th century, as Orthodoxy. Most of them conceived of modernity as an insidious threat in terms of its underlying ideology, however limited their understanding of it, and above all in terms of its destructive impact on increasing numbers of Jews. What concerned them was not the factors that had produced modernity, but the way in which it undermined faith and multiplied heresies and sin. Even if Mendelssohn was not, in their eyes, a renegade himself, he was unmistakably a breeder of heresies, a man who opened doors that should have remained shut. The Maskilim and reformers who walked through those doors, they could see all too well, equipped themselves with new philosophies and new methodologies that undermined the sanctity and absolute authority of the texts on which orthodoxy was based. What is new is forbidden by the Torah, proclaimed the Frankfurt-born architect of ultra-Orthodoxy, Moses Sofer. The Jews, he said, shouldn't even alter their clothing to conform to modern fashion. And parents should keep their children out of the schools that the modernizers were setting up. Some Orthodox leaders went as far as the early 19th century Polish rabbi, Menachem Mendel of Rymanov, who, in the words of scholar Mordecai Zalkin, not only raised walls against modernity so that it would not overwhelm the Jewish way of life, but fought against modernity itself. He deplored, for instance, the paving of highways, which led people to travel ceaselessly and to neglect the study of the Torah. Among the Orthodox, there also emerged, however, a camp that viewed modernity positively, despite its undeniable hazards. The discovery motivating this second thought about modernity, as Eliezer Schweid has put it, was the fact that modern secularism contains within itself certain elements which are positive from the point of view of the Jewish people or of religion, and even certain elements corresponding to the highest values of religion itself. It is therefore appropriate to reject the negative elements, to adopt the positive elements, and to propose in place of those philosophies and ideologies which pretended to be substitutes for religion, a renewed religious alternative, which once again places religion above and beyond modern secular philosophy, not through its absolute rejection, but by its reinterpretation and incorporation into Judaism, using tools borrowed from itself. The most outstanding figure in this camp was Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, who was generally regarded as the intellectual founder of Neo-Orthodox or modern Orthodox Judaism, but who identified his own school as that of Torah im derech eretz, or Torah together with the way of the land, that is, its culture, or what he deemed to be the best in its culture. For Hirsch, who was born in Hamburg in 1808 and spent the most important part of his life in Frankfurt, that meant primarily, but by no means exclusively, German culture. Hirsch also welcomed the modern emancipation of the Jews, which he perceived as representing, in his words, regard for the natural rights of men to live as equals among equals. Hirsch's view of history, the historian Mordecai Breuer has written, was determined by the Enlightenment's confidence in a steady spiritual and moral ascent of mankind, as sketched by Lessing in The Education of the Human Race, notwithstanding the derogatory view of biblical and Talmudic Judaism which had become apparent in this work. Hirsch, to be sure, believed that mankind's path was still full of pitfalls, such as the moral philosophy of Kant, which greatly overvalued the dangerous idea of human autonomy. But a Gesetztreue Judaism, one faithful to the divine law, had access to philosophical resources that could correct that misconception and ward off other threats as well. Hirsch did not like the reformers, Hirsch did not, like the reformers, abandon the idea of the Jews' restoration at any point to the land of Israel. But he did reject the idea of such a return by natural means in pre-Messianic times. Another rabbi who was much closer to the mainstream of contemporary orthodoxy than Hirsch believed that such a move was indeed called for, precisely because there were positive aspects of modernity indicating that the time for action along these lines had arrived. It was not Schiller or Kant or Hegel that convinced Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer that mankind had reached a new and better era, but the appearance of people like the Rothschilds. As Jody Myers has shown in her book on modernity and messianic activism in his writings, Kalischer, who was born in the Prussian province of Posen in 1795, regarded the emancipation of the Jews in the 19th century and the emergence of a powerful stratum of Jewish financiers as happy outcomes of divine intervention. He understood them to be signs that God now wished the Jews to take unprecedented action, to renew sacrificial worship in the Holy Land, and thereby to commence the process that would lead to the advent of the Messiah. Kalischer was, to be sure, very much an outlier, whose proposals seemed preposterous to most traditional Jews. Orthodoxy remained divided between a majority that looked askance at modernity and a minority that saw its good side but took no Zionist cues from it. Non-Orthodox Jewish thinkers remained, on the other hand, deeply appreciative of modernity to a man until the end of the 19th century. The rise of the Zionist movement at this time didn't change things. Even as Reform leaders generally denounced it as an atavistic, a backward idea, out of step with modernity and its more advanced understanding of Judaism, most Zionists who were not religious considered their movement to be an attempt to achieve for the Jews the fulfillment of the promise that modernity had extended to them in Europe, but had, as it seemed to them, quickly rescinded. In 1902, Theodor Herzl's futuristic novel, Altneuland, for instance, projected a reconstructed Jewish homeland that embodied the ideals of the Enlightenment far more than the dictates of the Torah, in its social organization, its culture, and also in its egalitarian treatment of its non-Jewish minority. The novel had its critics within the movement, to be sure, but they protested its excessively cosmopolitan flavor, not its modern spirit. Among the relatively few Orthodox Jews who did take part in the Zionist movement, the prevalent tendency was to dissociate Messianism from Zionism and treat the latter as merely a pragmatic effort to rescue Jews from intolerable conditions in the diaspora. Rabbi Kalischer's messianic orientation did find an echo, however, in that of a far more significant figure who shared his understanding of modernity as the era in which the Jews would break out of their exile and undertake action that would trigger their redemption. Unlike everyone I have mentioned so far, Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook stemmed from outside the German Kulturbereich. He belonged to the small portion of the Orthodox rabbinate in Russia that was drawn to the Zionist movement, and in 1904 became the chief rabbi of Jaffa in Palestine. Like Rabbi Kalischer before him, Kook came to see the return to Zion as a very large step toward the total redemption of the Jews and the rest of the world as well. For him, however, it was not the Jews' unprecedented advancement that signified change. His optimism was the product of a blend of Western philosophical and Kabbalistic ideas that I cannot elucidate here, and not just because I lack the time, and that yielded a strikingly positive stance toward modernity. He was, in the words of Aviezer Ravitsky, a typical figure of the 19th century, when the prospects for the human spirit, human achievement, and human freedom were thought to be constantly improving. It's not that Kook approved unqualifiedly of all modern expressions of human freedom. He was deeply disturbed by the way in which his fellow newcomers to Palestine were throwing off the yoke of the commandments. But quite famously, he saw in their very rebelliousness the imprint of the hand of God. He believed, as Ravitsky puts it, that the modern Zionist awakening, too, springs from a holy source, however hidden or unrecognized. The very fact that Israel is returning to its land, its language, and its collective form of life will ultimately prove to have been a return to God. That return would be followed by the restoration of the Jews' pre-modern way of life. In 1909, 5 years after Rabbi Kook took up his position in Jaffa, the Vienna-born and still quite young thinker Martin Buber made a famous visit to Prague, where he commenced a series of lectures before the Bar Kokhba Society, a group of Jewish university students grappling with their Jewish identities. Collected into a single volume in 1913 entitled On Judaism, Buber's lectures, more than any other contemporary Jewish writing, represented a rejection of the mentality then prevalent within Western Jewry. With inflections suggestive of Nietzsche's Zarathustra, as Paul Mendes-Flohr has written, Buber attributed the sterility of the modern period to the extinction of heroic, unconditional living. Modern determinism, in particular, he felt, had undermined confidence in the superhuman and in the potential of an individual's will, decision, and deeds to shape the becoming of the world. The remedy for this situation for the Jews, according to Buber, was to look not westward for enlightenment, but eastward to recover and return to Ur-Judentum, an elemental Judaism. What exactly this meant, and it did not mean a restoration of the kind Rabbi Kook had in mind, and how much influence Buber had are not, however, subjects in which we can delve in this brief presentation. We cannot leave him unmentioned, but we have to leave him aside in view of the limited appeal in his own day of his anti-modernist stance. Nothing that he, or for that matter, anyone else wrote, has deflected the vast majority of Reform and modern Orthodox thinkers of his day from their enthusiastic welcome of modernity. I might also throw in, for good measure, conservative Jews, who occupied the middle ground between Orthodoxy and Reform, calling for careful and gradual adjustment to modern conditions. And for that matter, their most significant offshoot, the Reconstructionist movement. No one went further than the leader of this new movement, the initially Orthodox American Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan, in the affirmation of modernity as the touchstone for a meaningful and durable Judaism. Kaplan, as Arthur Hertzberg put it in his introduction to the reprint of his 1934 magnum opus, Judaism as a Civilization, was able to construct a version of the Jewish religion without supernaturalism, without any affirmation of the existence of a supramundane God. he made a bold, honest venture to accept the whole of modernity, especially its fundamentally relativist notions about all human cultures, and find a way of asserting the significance of Judaism. This broad affirmation of modernity was the rule before the Holocaust, and it remains so after it for most Jewish thinkers who saw Nazism as an aberration, the antithesis of modernity, not its logical culmination. Emet ve'emunah, truth and faith, the most recent statement of principles issued by the conservative movement in America in 1988, makes the following claim. It is conservative Judaism that most directly confronts the challenges to integrate tradition with modernity. By retaining most of the tradition, while yet being hospitable to the valuable aspects of modernity, it articulates a vital, meaningful vision of Judaism for our day. 11 years later, the statement of principles issued by the Reform movement in Pittsburgh reflected comparable confidence in modernity. We continue to have faith that in spite of the unspeakable evils committed against our people and the sufferings endured by others, the partnership of God and humanity will ultimately prevail. Among the modern Orthodox, it is true, enthusiasm for modernity may be less wholehearted, but it's still there. But this isn't the whole story. The most extreme of the Orthodox, the so-called Ultra-Orthodox, have never ceased to regard modernity as an insidious and subversive force. Decimated by the Holocaust, they have nonetheless rebuilt strong enclaves in certain pockets of the West and in Israel, where they sometimes have to struggle to maintain the barriers against the outside world. One of their most famous sects, the Lubavitch or Chabad Hasidim, even seem to have ensconced themselves successfully in the modern world. They have embraced, as Samuel Heilman put it, many of the open and integrationist elements of adaptive modern orthodoxy as they sought language with which to connect to all kinds of assimilated Jews. Yet, as Heilman also notes, in doing so, they were acting as agents provocateurs, people who seemed open to modernity and America, but only in order to change it, to come down to the level of the lost soul, in order to retrieve and redeem it by getting it to repent and return. The urgency with which they pursue this goal is directly related, moreover, to their belief that modernity is about to be superseded by the Messianic era. The same is the case with respect to disciples of Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook and his son, Tzvi Yehuda Kook, who have devoted themselves to the pursuit not of stray souls, but the settlement of territory, ancestral land occupied by Israel, but not fully possessed by it, in the expectation of thereby hastening the arrival of the Messiah. But their progress has often been impeded by political circumstances, including the opposition of secular Jews, who have proved so far to be less in step with their program than the Kookists had initially expected them to be. On the fringes, it has induced some disappointed activists to retreat from their engagement with modernity. The Kookists who have not become discouraged, however, have continued their efforts to change things in Israel, both to fortify the position of traditional Judaism within the state, and above all, to strengthen its grip on the whole land of Israel, including what is known as the West Bank, and thereby to hasten the advent of the Messianic era. One could even say, to some degree, that the current domestic turmoil in Israel is due to their efforts to achieve these goals in collaboration with ultra-Orthodox parties who don't endorse their messianic activism, but want to curtail as much as possible the impact of the modern world on their own insular communities, which the State of Israel has enveloped. Outside of Israel, some ultra-Orthodox groups are similarly engaged in highly publicized and controversial efforts to protect their children from receiving more than the rudiments of a modern education. But these defensive actions have nothing like the same import or resonance. Less visible than the ultra-Orthodox foes of modernity, but still deserving of our attention, are the decidedly unorthodox Jewish thinkers who have rejected modernity's philosophical claims and labeled themselves postmodern. Concentrated mostly in the United States, their critique of modernity is mainly a philosophical one and mostly indistinguishable from that of their non-Jewish peers or their non-religious Jewish peers. But they do lay somewhat greater emphasis, I think, on the failure of modernity in practice as evinced by the events of the 20th century, especially the Holocaust. Pointing to the German-born Canadian theologian Emil Fackenheim as one of the thinkers who paved the way to Jewish postmodernism, Edith Wishegrad commends him for elucidating how the unprecedented attempt to exterminate a whole people shows that the formative values of Western culture failed to prevent the emergence of radical evil. Speaking in her own right, she goes further. Western culture not only failed to prevent evil, it contributed to it. Although largely attributable to deep-seated anti-Semitism, she writes, the building of the camps can be seen, at least in part, as the outcome of modern social organization and new technologies rooted in modernist conceptual foundations. In examination of the versions of Judaism that Jewish postmodernist thinkers have been cobbling together is beyond the scope of this paper, but they are not all, as one might suspect, far from the beaten path. It's worth noting that postmodernism has found some echoes among Orthodox thinkers, even those who have recognized the advantageous side of modernity. The foremost among them was the fairly recently deceased Shimon Gershom Rosenberg, an Israeli rabbi strongly influenced by Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook. Known primarily by the acronym that became his cognomen, Shagar, he saw the demise of modernity not as a threat, but as an opportunity to explore promising new possibilities for religious Zionism. But this, too, is something we don't have the need or the time to investigate. Jewish conceptions of modernity, then, range from the wholly negative on the part of ultra-Orthodox Jews to more ambivalent ones on the part of figures like Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook and Chabad Hasidim, to the wholly positive on the part of the most representatives of modern Judaism. The ultra-Orthodox have too little familiarity with the intellectual roots of modernity to be able to judge it in its own terms. They condemn it solely on the basis of its nefarious impact on the Jews' devotion to their God and his law, and strive to keep it out of their own precincts. Kook and Chabad see modernity through theological lenses that reveal its favorable aspects to be nothing more than signs of divine plans that wholly transcend modernity's own narrow horizon. The vast majority of religious Jewish thinkers, however, mostly non-Orthodox, but also modern Orthodox, continue to regard modernity as more of a blessing than anything else. This is true, too, of others whom I have barely mentioned here. Secular Jews who do not adhere to Judaism as a religion, but still believe in the enduring value of Jewish culture. Together, these people constitute the latest representatives of the line that we have traced are more or less progressive Jewish thinkers extending from the Haskalah to the Holocaust and beyond. Even those who are in tune with modernity, however, are not altogether untroubled by it anymore. While they do not see it as evil, they do share, in varying degrees, a certain trepidation about what it represents. At the same time that it holds open a door to the Jews and gives them room to hope that their highest aspirations for themselves and the rest of the world will be fulfilled, it poses a grave danger. Benevolent as it is toward the Jews in comparison to what preceded it, and as they understand things, briefly but horribly interrupted it, it has been, since its inception, a dangerous tendency, or it has had a dangerous tendency to swallow them up. Contemporary Jews concerned about their people watch as higher and higher percentages of them, in the diaspora at any rate, enjoying the benefits of liberal modernity, shed their Jewish identities, usually without much reflection or discomfort, and disappear into the general population. And they wonder where all of this will lead. Thank you.